Episode 12, Thresholds, Theory and Practice, Part 1.
Welcome to the Oxidative Potential Podcast, where we discuss all things sports science and performance. I'm your host, Matthew DeRoche, and with me is my fellow co-host, Phil Patterson. Enjoy. Good day, folks. In today's episode, Phil and I discuss thresholds, theory, and practice. So we get into the details on how do these protocols actually apply to testing thresholds. Also, we get into what thresholds might be easier to test than others. Where does some of these thresholds have pros and cons to them? Like, for example, critical power versus FTP. And we also kind of talk a little bit about the diagnostic tools used to test these specific thresholds. So this one is much more the theory part more than the practice. So we get into why are some of them more popular than others. And it might not just be because they're more accurate, but maybe it's just because of easy use, right? So the next episode that me and Phil recorded is much more the practice side of things, where we talk about how to train these thresholds. What is the literature saying out there and trying to move these things up or down, depending on who you are. And so hope you enjoy. If you want to get any information on how to get in contact with Phil or I, it will be in the show notes where it usually is. And enjoy the episode.
All right, Matt, we're back.
Yes, sir.
Very excited to talk to you. So we just had a little bit of a small conversation offline, but I did want to commend you on your great interviewing skills, at least with Evan. I've only had a chance to listen to that podcast thus far. So, and I really, really enjoyed it. You guys go down some cool rabbit holes and stuff that I'm very interested in as like a molecular mitochondrial physiologist.
Mm-hmm.
So it was really fun to hear you guys talk about that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I like those types of conversations. Like I do like hearing people, just answer specific questions, but also I like more of the style of throwing stuff out there and just seeing what they do with it and where they go with it.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Whenever you kind of outlay some of your, perceptions and concepts and theories around things, and seeing what they can either, smash or, add to or kind of reformulate. It's always nice to hear stuff kind of spinning off one another.
Yeah. And I've had a lot of really good conversations with Evan in the past about, he's always on the kind of like the cutting edge of technology and everything. And, his idea, of like having like a genetic sequencer, like, at the tip of your fingers and those sort of things. Like that's such a cool idea, to figure out how people respond to exercise, what's important for that response and all of that. So I'm going to need to have some conversations with him about that. Cause I've done, I just submitted a paper for review where we looked at changes to RNA sequencing, or changes to the transcript, so gene regulation, after 2 weeks of high intensity interval training. And one of the challenges right now is, first of all, it's expensive, which he noted. But there's definitely a different signature between, acute response to exercise and then training induction to those mRNA signals to exercise and those sort of things. So as we learn more and more and more, I'm definitely interested in jumping on a call with him and seeing, like, what does he think about this and all that sort of stuff.
It's funny because I've been into tendons for a long time, which is kind of funny because I just ruptured my tendon on Friday, one of my tendons.
Yeah,
but it was just kind of freak.
By the way.
Yeah, freak accident. But there's a guy called Keith Barr, and he's like a molecular exercise physiologist, and he studies tendons. And what he's shown is the different loading parameters and the types of loading, whether it's like myometric or plyometric, well, concentric, eccentric, or isometric, essentially, um, all kind of produce different mRNA signaling, right?
Mhm.
And they all kind of produce different gene transcription, which is, I think, very important, especially when we're trying to understand different adaptations that we're looking for, especially whether it's for tendon stiffness or tendon
Mhm.
pliability and resilience. Those are two kind of opposite directions, and both can be kind of crafted in the weight room, but they have to be crafted carefully if you're looking to go in a certain direction.
Yeah.
And I think when people just hear, "Oh, I'm going to go train my tendons because weights," or whatever it is they're training, but you have to understand which way you're training the tendon, because many cases with ruptures or many cases with muscle injuries at the junction, the myotendon junction, um, a lot of those are caused because one direction is gone too far. You're
Mhm.
pulling the organism in one direction too far without knowing it, and you have a weak point, and that's what happens.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's just freak accidents, but sometimes it's a lot of anyways. It's a very interesting field. I think it's going to be
Yeah.
crazy to see the next 10-15 years.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And for those of you who aren't, really familiar with the central dogma, which is like, kind of a out there biology concept. Basically, you have your DNA. When there is stress to the system, your DNA gets transcribed into this stuff called RNA. And the RNA is what's kind of the important messenger system to upregulate the translation of proteins. Proteins are the functional building blocks of all of our cells, enzymes, all that sort of stuff. So when we're talking about RNA, we're talking about kind of this message that gets induced with exercise training. And something I do, kind of want to just throw out there is that just because you have a signal, just because you have
Yeah,
mRNA
doesn't mean
being
translation.
upregulated does not mean it is
Yeah,
translated into
yeah,
protein.
that's true.
Perfect example of this, a guy named Bruce Spiegelman, who's
Hmm.
like a massive name in PGC1 alpha.
Yeah.
If you've heard that term before, the mitochondrial master regulator. Um, Basically was saying that PGC1 alpha is super unique in that in response to exercise, you get a massive upregulation in the mRNA.
Hmm.
But because of the way that the mRNA is made, like almost none of that is actually translated into
Yeah.
protein content.
Yeah.
So we have to take everything kind of with
Grain of salt
a
there.
little bit of a grain of salt. Exactly. The
Yeah.
way that I have been explaining it to some of the undergrads in my lab is that um, we're all familiar with Harry Potter, right? So or I hope a lot of
I
us are
wasn't allowed
familiar with
watching
it.
it, so.
Oh, wait, really?
No, keep
Uh,
going though. Keep going.
okay. So
Funny.
during like the first book, um, Dumbledore and Hogwarts is trying to tell Harry that he's a wizard. So they're sending him
Mhm.
all these letters. That's your
Yeah.
mRNA.
Yeah.
All these
That's
letters are
nice.
piling up at the door, but Harry's uncle and stuff like that aren't letting him read the letter. So,
Mhm.
but eventually, they send him 10,000 letters, and one of those letters gets through, and then Harry can finally read it. And that's kind of the difference between the message, the
Mhm.
mRNA, and the ability to actually do something with it. Like you might have 10,000 letters that are coming through that door, but if you don't
Yeah.
have one eye on it, then there's no functional outcomes that change. Harry would have never known he was a wizard unless he actually read one of those letters.
Yeah.
So that's
That's a
kind
great
of how
analogy.
I've been describing it to my undergrads, and it's a gross oversimplification, um, but
Yeah.
yeah. So
Yeah.
I think we can kind of jump into today's talk. So something that we've been discussing, Matt, back and forth is, now kind of we've been doing, VO2 max. We talked about, like, performance threshold, efficiency, those sort of things. And now we're doing a deeper dive on all of those topics. So
Mhm.
today we're going to kind of start to dive into performance threshold. And I'm going to call it performance threshold because um, we need a little bit larger of a definition or a
Yeah.
word as an umbrella because as you'll see in just a second, there's maybe hundreds of different defined performance thresholds, based on
Yeah.
lactate, ventilatory values, NIRS values, those sort of things. So we
Yeah.
need a bigger umbrella term. I'm going to call it performance threshold. Um, and then from there, we'll kind of explore the history of it and those sort of things and just kind of dive down this rabbit hole. Hopefully, with the idea that at the end, we sort of start talking about what are the true applications of all of this.
Yeah. How do we move them? Yeah. So let's probably just start off understanding what are these thresholds delineating? There's specific domains of exercise intensity, and we have these thresholds or, markers basically that kind of notify us of specific shifts going on inside the physiology
Mhm.
that are inherently going to affect our performance. For
Right.
example, if you're running at a certain speed, let's say 10 miles an hour, or sorry, 10 minute mile versus a 7 minute mile, you're going to be in two different domains of exercise intensity.
Mhm.
But that marker or one of the markers is going to lie somewhere in between those. And when you go over that, things are going to shift and
Mhm.
physiology is going to move in a much different direction, much faster.
Yeah.
So maybe we'll start there.
Yeah. Yeah. I can kind of jump into that. So there's two. Well, so depending on who you ask and who you talk to, there's either
Yeah.
3 domains or 5 zones or whatever it is. But I like to use kind of like the 3 domain idea.
Yeah.
Um, and each one of these thresholds is going to be, like you were saying, a delineator between either a shift in metabolism or a shift in the maintenance of homeostasis. So when we talk about, say zone 2 training, you're looking at that boundary between the shift between fat metabolism and glucose metabolism. That's really the first boundary, and that is, if we're looking at the 3 domain model, the shift from moderate intensity to heavy intensity.
Mm-hmm.
When we go from heavy intensity to severe intensity, I hope I'm getting those terms right, but when we go from heavy
Yeah.
to severe,
Yeah.
you have another boundary that is essentially the body's ability. That boundary delineates the body's ability to maintain homeostasis, like energetic homeostasis, oxygen homeostasis, other things like that, and not able to maintain it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So all of these, performance thresholds or whatever you want to call them, that's all they're trying to do is estimate where these boundaries are occurring.
Yeah.
So the I think the best place to start maybe might be, just a brief history of, kind of like where this came about. And actually, first let's back up and let's just say, so you can measure thresholds using lactate measurements,
Mm-hmm.
ventilatory measurements if you're fortunate enough to have a metabolic cart with VO2 and VCO2.
Mm-hmm.
And more recently, people have been starting to use NIRS devices to try to delineate or estimate these fatigue thresholds. And it should be noted that with any sort of methodology, depending on how you measure it, what the protocol is, like those sort of things, you can get slightly different estimates of where these thresholds are occurring. And I haven't listened to the podcast with Jem yet, but
Yeah.
his, at least from other things that I've listened to from him, their whole coaching philosophy is all about fatigue thresholds or performance thresholds are always changing, and they're always different on
Yeah.
all these different components of the body. So
Yeah. You're measuring different things, and because of their place in the physiology, they're going to kind of send signals, these emergency signals at different times, or signals of shifting essentially.
yeah.
um and that's why your performance, and that's why software now is coming out to try and detect thresholds. And there's several things out there like critical power, FTP, where the reason why these things work is because your performance is inherently tied to that shift in physiology. So
Mhm.
we know that if your performance is doing this specific curve downwards or this specific point of failure or whatever it is that you're measuring, we know that you are in that specific state, or the state is somewhere under that where we can measure with a calculation.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, so that's kind of why some of these performance tests can do a really good job at understanding what is the threshold here that we're looking for.
Yeah.
Much more the second threshold, but yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So where this idea kind of came from was this identification, at least from my understanding, this identification of I'm going to put lactic acid in quotes,
Yeah.
because there's a lot of debate, and in general, it doesn't actually exist within the muscle cell. Anyways, syntax aside, so there's identification of lactic acid back in 1780, so a long, long time ago, where
Mm-hmm.
cells that had been isolated, or milk that had been isolated, eventually builds up this byproduct of metabolism, and or it without the presence of oxygen. So eventually, two really smart guys, A.V. Hill and Otto Meyerhoff, kind of took this idea and started to apply it to exercise physiology back in the 1920s, and they were noticing that there were essentially two domains of kind of exercise intensity, one that was highly dependent on oxygen utilization, and then another one that couldn't be explained fully by oxygen consumption itself.
Mm-hmm.
So building off of that, this idea that and so what they noticed is that muscles that were in a hypoxic environment made more lactate. Building off of that, uh, a paper by Saline, who's another big name in exercise physiology, essentially shows a direct correlation between muscle lactate, muscle pH, and then fatigue. So, as this idea that lactate was associated with a hypoxic environment, or lack of oxygen, and higher intensities started to gain popularity, this idea that maybe lactate is driving muscle pH down
Mm-hmm.
because of the direct correlation with it,
Yeah.
and then that's associated with fatigue. So then this idea started to be built that that lactate causes fatigue.
Yeah.
So they took a correlation, essentially misinterpreted it, and then that resulted in this idea that lactate or lactic acid is causing the burn in your legs, causing the fatigue that you're feeling. And that's still something that I hear from so many coaches, students I teach. You'd be amazed at how many people on discussion posts are like, oh yeah, like when we start talking about fatigue, yeah, the lactic acid that's building up in your legs,
Yeah.
that leads to an increased DOMS and those sort of things. And what I'll try to briefly convince the listeners of is that lactate is actually beneficial, which I hope a lot of people already kind of understand, and already sort of appreciate. But brief bioenergetics lesson. So when we are exercising at higher and higher intensities, we become more reliant on glycolysis. We simply just need higher rates of ATP production, and glycolysis is a very fast way of making more ATP. Generally, this coincides with a shift in the mitochondria's ability to uptake the final byproduct of glycolysis, which is pyruvate. So once you're getting the higher and higher exercise intensities, your mitochondria are incapable of providing enough ATP in order to support that exercise intensity.
Yeah.
This results in glycolysis being stimulated, more glycolysis leads to more end product, pyruvate. That pyruvate can no longer be uptaken into the mitochondria, so it gets converted into lactate.
Yeah.
The conversion of lactate takes two hydrogens away from NADH and then the cytosol. They don't really tell you where the other proton is coming from, in order to replenish NADH pools or NAD plus pools. NAD plus is arguably one of the most important molecules to keep glycolysis going. So if you cannot replenish your NAD pools, then one of the reactions within glycolysis, and I can't remember the exact one, that requires the reduction of NAD plus to NADH can't happen anymore, and therefore glycolysis would stop. Mm. So from that perspective, the creation of lactate actually allows glycolysis to continue to occur. And as long as you have glucose happening, or as long as you have glucose within your muscle, and as long as you have NAD plus from the production of lactate, you can continue to do glycolysis, which allows you to continue to exercise. On top of that, lactate can then be shipped out of the cell. It can be used in the mitochondria of other muscle fiber types. And if it can't be used in, or if the mitochondria are outstripped within those type 1 fibers, then it can be shipped out of those muscle cells, and then it gets into the blood where it can reach circulation. It can go to the brain, it can go to the heart, it can go to the liver, and it can be used there for energy production, essentially.
My understanding, like I've never heard this explained fully out, which would be the most mitochondrial rich organs in the body would be the brain and the heart. So if you're outstripping the ability in the muscle cell next to you, there would be, an excess of mitochondria to be able to deal with it in the brain and the heart.
That's a good question.
I've never heard why, though. That's the thing. That's why I'm just kind of throwing it out there. But
so I'm trying to. So there is, definitely in the heart. Like the heart is extremely mitochondrial rich. I'm less familiar with brain physiology.
The brain is even more, I think, pretty sure.
Yeah,
up to 10,000 in one cell. Something insane like that.
Okay. Yeah. But anyway, so I think though what it comes down to is, since we can have a continuous, above say lactate threshold 2, we have a continuous increase in lactate that kind of points towards more production of lactate from the muscle that is unable to be uptaken by other peripheral tissues. So essentially the muscle outproduces our body's ability to uptake lactate. So when we're measuring lactate, we're measuring the net balance between lactate production at the skeletal muscle and lactate utilization within the muscle, the liver, the heart, the brain. So from that perspective, this is where these ideas of lactate threshold kind of started to arise. You can simply take a small drop of blood, and then you can start measuring the accumulation of lactate progressively over different exercise intensities. And it gives a decent surrogate for, like fatigue accumulation and other things like that, because I'm not saying that lactate isn't a useful molecule to measure within the blood, because it is highly correlated with acidosis and fatigue. So this is where this whole idea started getting the ball rolling. Discovery of lactate, and then from there, it's just been a kind of wild west of people trying to determine what's the best way to measure lactate and all of that. And I guess that's as kind of like a little bit of a transition. Do you use lactate in like your coaching, or have you shifted?
I use it, but I don't solely like I would solely rely on it if it's just something someone wanted to cheaply, come in and test just the one thing. But generally I always use it with Moxie, and I with myself, I don't know how many times I've tested myself with lactate and Moxie now. Um, I find very, very, very tight correlations between the break points and the lactate turn points.
Mhm.
But with others I've tested, the break points kind of appear differently because of the kind of non-monotonic and monotonic curves. But yeah, I think those are good descriptions of what those curves look like. But yeah, so lactate, I think, and I was talking with this about this with Paul Larson the other day, is I'm excited for a continuous lactate monitor. I know people are
Mm,
kind of like lactate is useless, but I just think it's another physiological point that we can kind of pinpoint. And it's like, yeah, we can kind of find some of these things through, power data or whatever, but
mhm,
you're getting something, and yes, you can throw lactate off by eating a breakfast, like having a bagel and orange juice, or
mhm.
coming in fasted, or going out and training and increasing your blood volume over a couple weeks quite dramatically in the heat.
Yeah.
Body weight, all these things are going to shift lactate. How much you sleep, are you in a disease state, right?
Yeah.
Because that's why they test lactate in hospitals, right?
Right.
To see, and especially in veterinary medicine, they're very popular too, because they want to see what's going on as a patient going into shock. Um, anyways, but yes, I like lactate. I know why people might not like it. It's just a resource, and it's fairly cheap. So
Yeah.
I like it. And I mean, any athlete can go out there and buy a meter for $200, play around, and to find that first turn point. You're not really going to find that with power. You're not going to find that
Yeah.
with speed. You need something, whether it's DFA alpha 1, which can be tricky because of the
Mhm,
artifact, or gas exchange with a metabolic cart. You're going
mhm.
to need something, a NIRS
Yeah.
device. So it's cheap. You're going to get your first point. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. I just had a really good conversation with this really good cyclist. He reached out to me, and he's all about, well, what can I measure and what can I monitor in order to get my physiology better. And he just bought a lactate, or
Mm-hmm.
lactate meter. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and at first, because my bias coming from the research field is like, oh, lactate is useless. That's like my
Yeah.
first
Me too.
thought. Because I even have a paper pulled up right here that's like the predictive validity of ventilatory thresholds versus lactate thresholds.
Yeah.
Ventilatory thresholds are so much more powerful for predicting endurance performance. However, you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah.
Um, Lactate is exactly like what you were saying. It's really one of the only fairly affordable ways of figuring out that delineation between your moderate and your heavy zone. So it's figuring out like fat max,
Yeah.
unless you have access to like a metabolic cart, which, I love the VO2 Master just for the form and the like the ease of use and all of that sort of stuff. But right now they don't have CO2. So you can't really actually determine where that fat max zone is,
Mm-hmm.
because if you don't have CO2, you don't have, the different ratios telling you what substrates you're oxidizing.
Yeah.
So other than like DFA alpha
Alpha
1,
1.
there's really, it's really hard to estimate where your boundary for zone 2 or fat max or whatever you want to call it
Yeah.
is. So that's where I think like lactate could be super useful for that. You could also
Yeah.
use lactate as a measure, or as like a surrogate for nutrition status.
Yeah.
I was talking to Adrian Moondweiler, who's like, qualified for the CrossFit Games a bunch of times, and he's used lactate a lot. And he was saying that when he is fully recovered, fully glycogen repleted
Mm-hmm.
from training and all of that, he can go and do like, like a Fran style workout, right? 3.5 minutes, and get his lactate up to like 22, which
Mm-hmm.
is insanely high.
Yeah.
But when he's fatigued, he said that value may not get above like 14.
Yeah. And I've seen that with CrossFitters too. I can't remember where I've seen that, whether it was in the research, and they had a poor ability to gain higher lactate. And I was thinking, well, I think it's probably just because they're overtrained. Like CrossFitters, a lot of the times they're overtrained, HPA dysfunction. A lot of things can end up happening when you're putting this same kind of stimulus over and over again with that high intensity.
Right. Right.
Um, but yeah, and that's the thing about lactate. Like I had this conversation with Jem a little bit, and people, here's something that I think people might kind of see with me if I can carry people into what I'm thinking about is the more sensitive a device is, the more variables you are that are going to be able to manipulate that measurement, right?
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about HRV versus heart rate. Is HRV useless because it's more varied than your morning resting heart rate every morning? Well, I did this and it threw off my HRV. And it's kind of the same argument I hear with NIRS. It's the same argument I hear with lactate. And it's like, well, if you want a sensitive measurement, well, you're probably going to see some variability,
Mm-hmm.
right? And also, for example, now people would say, well, when we're testing, we don't want something that variable. Okay, then we'll make sure that your testing protocol and the day before you're testing, everything is the same. And you're going to get fairly similar results. Like if you go
Right.
out and smash yourself the day before a lactate test, and then another time you go test, you don't engage in any exercise, and you had a couple rest days,
Mm-hmm.
those are going to be two different, lactate curves
Right.
essentially.
Right.
Or the beginning is going to be different for sure, at least. Like you're resting and coming into your, but and the same thing I hear with orange juice and this and that, or drinking this before. I think, yeah, of course, it's a sensitive measure. You're going to see some flux because of what you did. But if you go out and just kind of keep things stable and test, it's going to be fairly useful.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so yeah, that's my kind of thought. Is like sometimes having a sensitive measure is really good. Like I think NIRS for understanding, is my muscle able to utilize oxygen right now? Is there too much
Mm-hmm.
trauma that's
Mm-hmm.
happened and I'm not utilizing oxygen as good as I could be?
Yeah.
Well, you're going to need a sensitive measure. VO2 is not going to tell you that.
Right. Heart
Anyways,
rate's not going to
sorry.
tell you that, right? Because
Yeah,
your heart
yeah.
rate, like for instance, the guys at WOD Science just shared like the physiological response to Murph, and they've been using Moxie.
Hmm.
And first mile, you know, near signal super, super nice. Like, went down, probably stayed at, I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was like, 20% for the first mile.
Hmm.
Did non-partitioned. So, you get to, like the 300 squats and you see it like, it's like kind of high, from
Yeah,
the push-ups. And then it
yeah.
just, drops down back to 20% for a while,
Hmm.
goes on the subsequent run. And SMO2, I messaged him and asked, or I commented and asked, I was like, oh, it's like, how fast was your second mile compared to your first? He was like, well, it was super slow, but but I felt like I was going a lot harder.
Hmm.
And the amount of desaturation within, the muscle was only like 30%. So there was like a
Yeah,
rise from 20% to 30%. And if we're going to truly get to a point where we are, monitoring our physiology in real time, we need something that is that sensitive, because heart rate
yeah.
just stayed the same the entire time. It's like
Exactly,
160, 170.
exactly.
Um,
Um,
so it
and
doesn't get
maybe I'm
the best picture.
Yeah, maybe we're wrong on that, but I think it's just that, just like HRV, I got textbooks on HRV, dude. It's a super complex subject, and we shouldn't just be able to understand it by taking a quick course or reading a quick book on it.
Mm-hmm.
It's probably going to take years and years for us to fully understand what all these things mean. What are the signals that are being sent down, and how does that influence? Anyways, yeah, that's a good topic, but
Yeah.
I'll let you
Yeah.
kind of.
Dial us back in.
Yeah, dial us back in. Yeah.
um, so I mean, so just to jump off of that, right? Maybe that's the reason why all of these different determinants of lactate threshold, ventilatory threshold, all that sort of stuff are slightly different,
Mhm.
because either the sensitivity is different, the protocol is slightly different,
Mhm.
and or just the population is different, just in
Mhm.
general. So that's, I guess, like so if we're doing like a little bit of a timeline, right? Let's recap. Lactate threshold and lactate variables, have been used for a really, really long time, gained a ton of popularity. We don't think that, I think overall, if you want to use it, go ahead, because there's
Mm-hmm.
a lot of people who have done a lot of work on it consistently.
Mm-hmm.
So lactate, definitely useful. On the flip side of things, once metabolic carts became, more accessible, a little bit more like easier to use in terms of like, like the graphics and displays and all that sort of stuff, people started working or looking at how ventilatory variables change with increasing exercise intensities, and have come up with, again, a number of different variables that all try to estimate your second ventilatory threshold and first ventilatory threshold. And from at least a predictive performance standpoint. So there's this study by Marcus Amon, and the second author is Andy Sabuti, who's actually on my committee for my master's degree. So I got really familiar with a lot of his work. But they looked at the predictive validity of ventilatory threshold compared to lactate threshold, and really showed that lactate threshold, or ventilatory and lactate threshold, were both very significantly good at predicting 40-kilometer time trial performance, which, again, not surprising, right? If we're thinking about performance is based on how well you can sustain homeostasis. And if we're trying to predict that turning point of where you can't sustain homeostasis anymore, then being able to, or then by measuring that, we're going to get a good surrogate for whatever the true exercise intensity that you can maintain is. And that's exactly what they showed, even though they showed a little bit more strong significance between ventilatory threshold values and 40-kilometer time trial performance. One of the, so physiologically, actually, the reason why ventilatory thresholds are useful is because so you have your VO2, so the amount of oxygen you're intaking and intaking and utilizing, and then you have your VCO2, so how much CO2 you're producing, and your body is actually extremely sensitive to minute changes in CO2. It'll change.
Chemoreceptors.
Yeah, those chemoreceptors are super, super sensitive. So if you have just like a very, very slight change in your CO2, it can induce things like, hyperventilation and all of that, because just from the nature of it, your body doesn't want to have excess CO2 around. On the flip side of things, oxygen, a little bit less sensitive, but by measuring both of those in tandem, you can start to see disproportionate rises in CO2 compared to O2. And those are, kind of where people think, these thresholds are coming from. And the reason why we have a disproportionate increase in CO2 is kind of what we were talking about, is ATP hydrolysis is releasing a lot of hydrogens. Those hydrogens have to be buffered somehow. It's not lactate. Those hydrogens have to be buffered somehow. And eventually, once you get over the body, the internal muscular environment that can safely or efficiently buffer hydrogens, those hydrogens start to, kind of leak out into the blood. In the blood, they're buffered by bicarbonate and carbonic anhydrase. And basically what happens is you buffer those hydrogens, and then your bicarbonate gets broken down into H2O and CO2. So at higher and higher exercise intensities, when we have more protons being produced, you have greater CO2 production than what would actually be occurring just based off of like glucose metabolism or fat metabolism.
This is and this is why kind of all these things link together, is because they're different, like there's physiological changes, but they're marking different points because you're measuring different, surrogates essentially
Right.
of that, right? When you're measuring different surrogates like lactate versus CO2, there's 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 going to be a little bit of discrepancy there, but
Right.
they link up extremely well. Like I've heard even, and I've seen this with VT1 on the cart and lactate threshold. If you, Mark Burnley was the guy that actually educated me on this because I always noticed it was a little bit lower, but you have to account for the ramp rate because in a lactate test, you have these long steps, right?
Hmm.
Generally, I use like 5 minutes, 4 to 5 minutes. If they're a more elite athlete and they can kind of stabilize earlier, then you can go maybe 3 minutes.
Right.
But versus a ramp, which you're going up every minute,
Hmm.
right? The physiology is going to kind of need to be corrected to mimic the 5 minute step.
Hmm.
So you would subtract 2/3 of your ramp rate, which is just how much you're increasing every minute, right? So if it's 30 watts every minute, you're just going to subtract 2/3 of that, and that's where your LT1 is going to be.
Mm.
Um, and he's found great success with that. I've heard him talk about this on the Scientific Triathlon Show, which is really, really great podcast. Um, and yeah, if you do that with your cart data, or if you're getting VO2 tested, that's kind of how you would get your lactate. But I mean, whatever. What I'm trying to say here is they line up, but you just have to
Yeah.
account.
Yeah. You have to account for kind of like the slight lag in physiology, right? Like,
Yeah.
and that's why I really like, kind of using NIRS devices is that, I'm
Mhm.
very convinced that, where uh, the majority of the signal for, say, fatigue or other metabolites and those sort of stuff is coming from the muscle. And I think a lot of people would agree.
Mhm.
um, so if you're measuring at the muscle, you're probably measuring kind of like that first step, whether like, if there's a break point or other things like that.
Mhm.
And then after that, you would get something like, it should be like lactate values.
Mhm.
And then after that, you would get ventilatory values because it's all kind of like
Yeah.
just a slight lag. And that's something that Andrew Feldman and I have kind of talked about is we noticed in some data that we're working on that um, our critical oxygenation number is slightly lower than our lactate values that we measured.
Yeah.
And that's most likely, again, because of that temporal nature of
Mhm.
it just takes a little bit more time, for the responsiveness of the actual of lactate.
System. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Versus
Yeah.
ventilatory versus skeletal muscle. Um, so I guess that's a good caveat, right? Into using then NIRS, because NIRS is kind of like uh, the new thing,
Yeah.
especially with coaches and athletes and those sort of things. NIRS has been around for quite a while within the research community. But mostly I think it's been used for like brain oxygenation for a really long time.
Yeah.
But all bias aside, so I've worked for Moxie for a long time, so that's kind of like my little, what is it, conflict of interest
Yeah.
disclaimer.
Buy a Moxie, everyone.
Yeah,
I'm trying
yeah,
to sell you
exactly.
Moxies.
Roger, sponsor our podcast. Um, I didn't use Moxie. I used a different NIRS device within my master's degree.
Mhm.
And we measured, like NIRS breakpoint, all of that sort of stuff. But
Mhm.
now with, kind of like these commercially available devices, Train Red, Moxie, previous ones in the past, like Human and BSX or whatever,
Mhm.
it kind of gives you insights directly into your skeletal muscle. So then you can see how oxygen utilization at least the capillary bed, maybe not, directly within the muscle, is
Mhm.
changing in real time
Mhm.
in response to whatever load you're placing upon it. And there's massive debates on, again, whether like, oh, are these boundaries and thresholds like actually occurring at the same time? And some people think they are, some people think they aren't, and it depends what you correlate it to. It depends, like, if you're putting it to VO2, if you're putting it to heart rate, other things like that. And again, I think where we're kind of losing the granularity of, using a device or using a NIRS device is, let's stop trying to correlate it to heart rate and VO2
Yeah.
max and those
Yeah.
sort of
Yeah.
things, and just look at what the data is telling us in real time.
Yeah.
Because again, heart rate's not sensitive enough. A lot of us, can't afford a $5,000 medical or metabolic device to measure our VO2. So from that perspective, it's like, let's just, what is the physiology actually telling us? What is the oxygenation profile telling us? And then how can we use that to inform our decisions of, whatever, how we're working out and other things like that. Because I definitely think, oh, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. No, go ahead. I want to hear.
Oh, I was going to say, I definitely think it's like we're doing a disservice to a lot of ourselves and athletes we coach by, just measuring a lactate threshold, a ventilatory threshold, whatever it is, and then having them train for 6 months, because those thresholds change on a daily basis.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
well, this is a good point. And something that I want to kind of dig into here is, if you're, for example, you see a cyclist going out there and smashing 30-hour weeks or maybe 35-hour weeks, go look at Niels van der Poel. I'm not saying what Niels did is what everyone should be doing. That's not what I'm saying.
Is he the speed skater?
Speed skater, yeah. So he was doing like 35-hour weeks for like 15 months or something. Insane. Yeah. Anyways, the reason why people can do that is because they're training. They have a really good understanding of these delineations. For example, I'm not saying that, 10 watts, 20 watts, 20 watts is going to make a difference. So if you're training 35 hours at 200 watts versus 30 or 35 hours at 225 watts, that's going to be a big difference, right? Mm-hmm. From day to day, if you're going to switch those, let's say for one day of training, if you're at 25 watts, versus, 25 watts less, it's not going to make a big difference. Mm-hmm. But when you add up 30 hours or 35 hours in a week and you're spending 80 or 85% of your training time there, those 25 watts is going to make a big difference. Mm-hmm. So I think one of the reasons people have a hard time with training volume, and I've seen this because I look at people's Stravas, I look at people's data that they put up wherever it is, and you can't hit this peak mileage, or I haven't been here in a while. And it's like, if you look at their heart rate, and I'm like, I know everyone's heart rate is going to vary, but you're just getting a kind of rough idea. Mm-hmm. And you look at the speeds that they're running at, you're like, there's a reason why you're not hitting 100 and 50-kilometer weeks or whatever it is because you're spending way too much. Or it's the same with cycling, more so because running is a lot of pounding, but you're probably spending too much time in one zone over the other. And 1 to 2 days, it's not going to make a difference. But if you're doing long weeks and over years and years and years, that 25 to 30 watts is going to make a difference. Mm-hmm. It's the same with high intensity. If you try and do 20 minutes under critical power by 5 watts, and you do 20 minutes over critical power by 5 watts, those are two different things.
Massively
totally different things. Mm-hmm. And yes, critical power is going to shift every day, or FDP is going to shift every day, but those are two massively different things. And if you go and read Niels's, his manifesto, training manifesto, you can even hear when he talks about, he's like, if I was under by 2 or 3 watts, dude, if I couldn't get it up there, I knew I was going to get sick if I just kept on, you know what I mean? Like it's so minuscule, these little shifts. Anyways, that's kind of a,
no, I think that's a great point, because now we can shift into like, what's like the true application of all of this, right? It's eventually where I see technology and thresholds and all that sort of stuff going is exactly what we're kind of alluding to, is like, you need to change your training intensity every single day based on the physiology that you have in that given moment. If you go to do a VO2 max test, and you're like, okay, well, I'm going to rest the 2 days before that. I'm going to be, fully glycogen, have my glycogen stores topped off, all of that sort of stuff. you're going to artificially enhance all of
The
those
thresholds.
measures. Yeah, all of those threshold measures, perhaps your VO2 max, if you're, somebody who works out too hard,
Mm-hmm.
and other things like that. And it's one snapshot that then drives 6 months of training.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's, again, it's good to get an estimate of it, but that's all it is an
Mm-hmm.
estimate.
Yeah.
So, whether you're, say for instance, let's say, yeah, that your zone 2 was determined, like the high end of your fat max zone was like 200,
Mm-hmm.
200 watts or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And you go out and you then train, you do a lot of zone 2 training, because you're trying to accumulate volume. If you're training
Yeah.
at, 200, but for some reason, something's happening where, you're not getting enough, say like nutrition or like other things like that, then you're
Yeah.
artificially enhancing the physiological demand
Mm-hmm.
of what's actually happening. So that 200 watts, that's no longer your fat max zone.
Mm-hmm.
You're actually, shifting more towards glycolysis, which,
Yeah.
it's not a bad thing. It's just less sustainable.
Yeah.
Um, and that's something that I've thought a lot about recently is like, so when I was running, a lot of coaches, they'd prescribe like, okay, I want you to hit, like 5 minutes to 5:15 for like these mile repeats that we're doing. And I would never be disappointed in myself for going 4:55 for a mile, but
Mm-hmm.
I would always be pissed at myself for going 5:20 for a mile.
Mm-hmm.
And I think even though the amount of time that you're off of hitting that interval is the exact same,
Yeah.
I think a lot of people, they're like, oh, if the goal is 5 flat, if I go faster than that, I'm good. If I go
Yeah. Yeah.
slower than that, I'm trash. And I think we
Yeah.
need to start to, kind of get rid of that, but we also need the technology available to us to actually change how we think about that and give ourselves the okay to say go easier on a given day.
Yeah.
Um, so
Yeah.
so that's all we're trying to do with these like boundaries and thresholds and those sort of things is we're trying to estimate where these delineations occur in order for us to be able to sustain more load and more volume over time.
Yeah.
And especially with a lot of zone 2 training, I just posted about this. Zone 2 training should give us the ability to accumulate more volume without accumulating massive amounts of fatigue and allowing for those adaptations to to be ingrained in our body. So
Mm-hmm.
from that perspective, right, if we're giving adequate stimulus, we're having mitochondrial expansion, so more ATP production coming from the mitochondria, greater lipid oxidation or fat oxidation capacity,
Mm-hmm.
all of this sort of stuff. But also, what it's there to do is allow us to become more efficient.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that is like really lost is like, and that's why, so this is why a lot of CrossFitters aren't very efficient with stuff because they just do high intensity interval stuff all the freaking time. They don't
Mm-hmm.
focus on zone 2 training, which is going to allow you to accumulate a lot of volume.
Mm-hmm.
And repetition is key for increasing, efficiency, economy, those sort of things. Like
Yeah.
all of those elite level runners who were, trying to do the Breaking 2 project,
Mm-hmm.
they like Eliud Kipchoge. I'm pretty sure he's run 10 years straight without an injury, without break, without those sort of things.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what's required in order to actually be like a super high level athlete.
Yeah. Yeah. Overtraining. And here's the thing, guys, like if you're training 5-6 hours a week, this doesn't really apply, but
Mm-hmm.
there is a case where it could apply is when if you're training, for example, I just spoke about this in a video I did on blood flow restriction training. The niche things out there that people are searching for, I think we should be looking to understand how we can maximize our adaptations. But what I want to say is there's this threshold, and it's like if you're training under this threshold hours weekly, like this weekly threshold hours, it's going to be less applicable to you. You know what I mean? If you can't accumulate 10 hours of training in a week, how much time, like if you spend, 10% of your time in zone 3 versus 5, it's not going to make a difference. If you're training 10 hours a week, it's not going to make a difference unless you are stressed to the max. And
Mm-hmm.
like that extra 5% just puts you over one day and you're sick now.
Right.
But you have to be stressed to the max for that to make a difference. So what we're talking about is like people that are, above those thresholds. For example, like if you look at the Norwegian triathlon team, they measure the amount of NIRS data that those guys have and a lactate data. Like they're always testing lactate data, like every
Mm-hmm.
workout pretty much that's higher intensity, even a lot of the low end intensity, just to make sure that they're and NIRS. So I mean, the reason why they're doing that is because if they go over, the chance of sickness, overtraining, injury, all those things increase. So kind of look at it this way: is like anytime we say anything on here, understand where in the spectrum you kind of lie.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you're training 5 hours a week and you're just trying to understand what am I aiming for, what are the levers I should be pulling, that's
Yeah.
fine. But if you're looking to be like, oh, I got to spend 7% in zone,
Yeah.
or the middle zone heavy domain versus 5, it's like it's not applicable.
Right. Right. Yeah. If
But
we
yeah,
if we take a step back, right, it's understanding where you are on the continuum of
yeah,
performance and those sort of things
yeah,
is super important. And the more minute details matter more for people who are riding that knife edge of performance and sickness.
yeah,
um yeah, I was just talking to another guy yesterday who was asking me like, oh, do I cap my runs and those sort of things to heart rate or to speed?
mhm,
And it's like, let's say that heart rate monitoring was the only thing that was available to you. That's still a very valid way of modulating your training.
yeah,
Um, and from that perspective, say for instance, you were supposed to do uh, 2 hours in zone 2, and your zone 2 occurs at like 120 beats per minute, then you should be modulating your speed or your power output in order to elicit an intensity that does not go above 120 beats per minute.
yeah,
So like I know a lot of people, especially in my CrossFit gym, who are like, man, I'm feeling pretty tired today. Like, I should probably take it easy. But then, of course, you have your buddies who are like, oh, dude, you're gonna go hard on this workout, and then you're working out right next to them. And you're just like, oh man, I gotta smoke this dude because this is a running workout and I'm good at running.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
When
yeah, for
or
sure.
when it would definitely be better for you to just stick to your 120, go slower depending on like uh, where your heart rate is at, and
Hmm.
track that over time. Um, so I think for like the newer athletes and like those sort of athletes, like heart rate can be perfectly fine when you're
Yeah,
first starting to develop yourself. It's a really easy number because it can be displayed on your watch, on your phone, on anything like that.
yeah,
But just make sure that you're actually modulating your intensity to be within that zone, right? Or
yeah,
else it doesn't matter. Like, what's the point of actually measuring anything if you're not going to actually make an informed decision
yeah.
with that?
And one other point on this is understand your, like, because I just talked about thresholds and it's to this like same thing with the heart rate, is understand where if you're walking 20,000 steps a day or more. For example, like I've done work sometimes where you're walking 40,000 steps a day and you're lugging really heavy stuff. And yeah, on 5 to 7 hours of training a week, you're going to be riding the knife's edge.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want to go over and try and steal from the heavy domain and severe domain to try and get more gains on less time, you're going to be riding that edge. Whereas sometimes I've been training comfortably on more than 15 hours a week, right? Closer to 20 hours a week. And, I could definitely manipulate a little bit more of different volumes and not really be riding the nice edge.
Mm-hmm.
So understand the demands of your day. Do you have a kid that's up screaming every night because of nightmares? Do you have a dog that you have to wake up every morning to let out to pee and disrupt your sleep at 5 a.m. or whatever? Understanding all these things is going to enhance your ability to modulate the time you're spending in zones and understanding, hey, you know,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. And I also, so my philosophy is that, consistency with whatever it is you're doing is key, to continually making gains, whether that's life, performance, relationships, anything.
Mm-hmm.
So from that perspective, I have never had a workout in CrossFit where if I go too easy, I'm pissed at myself.
Yeah.
Because I've never had a workout where if I go too easy, I get injured. Whereas
Yeah.
if
Yeah. Yeah.
whereas if I go too hard, I'm like, ooh, I'm feeling pretty good today. Let's deadlift, 225, or let's like for the actual workout, or let's like push it, like one more set,
Yeah.
a little bit higher. And then I
Yeah.
get injured and then I have to take 6 weeks off.
Mm-hmm.
I would say, it's like taking into account all the stress of your day, all the stress of everything that's going on. It is more important to be aware of that and take an easy day, because that hard workout can still be done the next day, even though
Yeah.
it's not on the schedule correctly, or it's not on that scheduled day, because consistency is going to reign over everything.
Yeah. Consistency.
So but I think, getting back to like, thresholds and all those sort of stuff,
Yeah.
it's like, let's say, like, even if you're like, say we go back to that walking example,
Mm-hmm.
to 20,000 steps, 40,000 steps, whatever it is,
Mm-hmm.
chances are your heart rate is pretty, like, zone 2 generally occurs at about 60% of your max heart rate. So for
Mm-hmm.
me, I'm just going to do a quick calculation. I know my max heart rate is about 180.
Mm-hmm.
So multiply that by 0.6. That's 108 beats per minute.
Yeah.
That's really low.
Yeah.
Just walking, you're probably going to get up, 90, maybe 100,
Oh
depending
yeah.
on. And so just walking can be adequate stimulus for zone 2 adaptations. So don't just
100%.
think, so if you're walking like 20,000 steps a day, like that's actually a decent stimulus for you to
100%.
improve. And that's actually what I contend. So over the pandemic and everything, I made it a point to walk 10,000 steps every single day.
Mm-hmm.
And now that so prior to pandemic and those sort of things, I haven't measured my VO2 max like before it started, but the highest I had ever seen was like 64 mils per kg.
Mm-hmm.
That was when I was like super fit, doing a lot of training.
Mm-hmm.
Reduced all my training over pandemic and all those sort of things, because I was just like couldn't handle, all the stress of the world. But did a lot of walking, and then I came back, and now I'm measuring my VO2 max again, and I've consistently been able to measure it at around 69, like 68 to 72.
Mm-hmm.
And I definitely haven't done more training volume. I just
Mm-hmm.
walk more and stay less
Yeah.
sedentary. So again, kind of highlighting this idea that like, you don't need to go out and kill yourself every day. You can still gain a lot of benefit from the consistency of, kind of low level activity. And sometimes that's actually going to be the best thing to help move your performance in the right direction.
Yeah. Yeah. I spent, like, especially when I'm injured, if you put something a little bit heavy on your back and you go walk out the door with your dog or whatever, you're probably going to be in zone 2. That's
Mm-hmm.
how I come back from a lot of stuff, is starting off with walking, because my fitness has been, a little bit deteriorated from whatever it is. And if you kind of look at the heart rates you're putting out when you're walking at a brisk pace, it's zone 1, zone 2, especially because your fitness is down for a lot of people anyways.
Yeah.
Or even people that are really fit runners sometimes, like their threshold comes on so early because they spend so much time in that top gear.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not metabolically that efficient, that coming back to that zone 2 pace is really, really, really slow in the beginning, because
Mm-hmm.
they haven't developed that system enough. Same with CrossFitters, right? That
Mm-hmm.
zone 2 is going to be really low for them most of the time. It's going to be almost walking pace. Yeah, so it's just understanding, like, training doesn't always have to be this thing where it's you're running hard, you're doing these things. I think we should talk on the next podcast that we do specifically on how to manipulate these thresholds. For the first threshold and the second threshold, we'll spend some time talking about whether it's critical power, FTP, critical velocity. How do we move these things? What are the protocols? Does everything move them? Do certain things move them better than others, depending on where you're at?
Right.
Yeah. But
yeah, I totally agree. And I just want to leave kind of everybody with this this idea that we've kind of digressed to more of a zone 2 training talk here, but one thing that I want to note is that at least in elite level athletes there's a lot of room for adaptation. And this is exactly what you were getting at, Matt, is like in the next podcast we'll talk about what are the specific things we can do to move that needle, whether it's the zone 2 or critical power, FTP, critical oxygenation, all that sort of stuff. How do we move it in the right direction? And I'll leave you guys with this. There's a paper that was published by, Andy Jones, Brett Kirby, Brad Wilkins, all the really big name scientists who worked on the Breaking 2 project. And they took 16 of arguably the fittest runners in the world, and they took them through metabolic testing, did all this sort of stuff. They measured LT1, which they described as the first sustained lactate above 2 millimolar, which is generally what is used for LT1. And then they looked at the lactate turn point, which is kind of like critical power or FTP, and they showed that these athletes had an LT that occurred at, I think, 85% of their VO2 max.
Yep.
And then their lactate turn point occurred at like 93% of their VO2 max.
Yeah.
So the reason why we're going to camp out on this for a few podcasts is because there is so much potential for gain in these thresholds compared to like things like VO2 max. VO2 max goes up, within, the first, like, say 4 months of training, and then generally stays fairly plateaued, maybe incremental increases over time. But with like threshold values, you could go from, your LT1 occurring at 50%. Yeah. And I mean, granted, there's genetic potential and other working potentials in there, but potentially get it up to like, 85% of your VO2 max. So that's a massive, massive opportunity for gain. And then same thing with, lactate turn point, right? If that's occurring at 94%, if you initially start at like 60%, again, that's like a 33% chance for increase over time. So yeah, we'll camp out on this for the next podcast, and we'll talk about a little bit more of like how people use it, how you use it in your prescription for training and those sort of things, since you're a little bit more involved directly with athletes, at least currently. But I hope this was informative for everybody. A little bit of the background, what's used, and then some interesting, kind of philosophical talks on actual training and those sort of things.
Yeah. So you can find us mainly on Instagram, because we link to all our stuff through Instagram. Phil is at Critical O2, and I'm at Resilience HPC, and we try and put out stuff. Phil does a great job of being super consistent. He's always got stuff out there every day, dumbing down all the intricate literature and verbiage and making it accessible. So you'll find a lot of good stuff there. And I post as much as I can. I usually do it in the form of video, because that's just easier for me to spit out some stuff and just that way. But yeah, so I hope you enjoy, folks, and have a good day.
Yep. All right. Later, guys.